Now, the question we now want to turn to is one of the, I shouldn't say the goal of the course, it should say a goal of the course. A goal of the course is to enable us to understand arguments. And what I want to do is explain to you that there's really a few things that go into analyzing and figuring out if arguments are good arguments or if they are not good arguments. And we call this argument analysis. And argument analysis, part of it is to be able to understand, that is, understanding or interpreting an argument presented in a passage. And that involves doing a whole bunch of things. One of which is to sit down and really think about what the author means. You need to gain an understanding of what the author means to understand his or her argument. Remember, we just talked about the part of the argument, premises or conclusions. You need to be able to identify the conclusion and to identify the premises of the argument. A lot of times, and I think we've seen these in some of the examples that we started with, there are sort of hidden assumptions or unstated assumptions or premises that are being made. And we got to figure out what those are to be able to be fair in analyzing the argument. And the other thing that you're going to see is oftentimes there are sort of what we might call rhetorical elements that are brought in. You know, there's a difference between rhetoric and reason. When you look at a presidential debate, a political debate, there's a lot of what goes on is to provide rhetorical strength to the person's position. That is, what the goal of that is not necessarily to be rationally correct, to have the best reasons, but to be most persuasive. Where you can see that is sometimes in a sales situation. Somebody's trying to sell you something. You know that you have a new telephone for you. And they start telling you about all the features, the great things, this, that, and next thing. They see how you react, you like this thing, and they hone in on this one thing. Does that mean that they're trying to help you make the best decision? No. They're trying to get you emotionally attached to that telephone. They want you to want to walk out of the store with that particular telephone. Now that's using rhetorical elements. The same thing happens in a debate. The way a candidate's debate, the way the candidate looks, whether he looks like a wise guy, whether he behaves with respect to the other person. There are a lot of things that influence people's decision. But here, when we're looking at arguments, we're only looking at the rational aspects. We just want to see the content of what is being said, and are those good reasons. So a lot of times when people are giving arguments, they don't just simply state, here's my conclusion and here are my premises, or here are my assumptions and here's my conclusion, but rather there's a whole lot of other material intended to persuade and sway your opinions on things, and we have to distinguish the premises and conclusions from the other material presented. Now, all of this is what goes on in the first step of argument analysis that we call reconstruct the argument. That's step number one, reconstruct the argument. And once we've gone through this, we will have an argument in standard form. You'll see what our standard form is. We're actually going to number the premises, and the last thing that we're going to hit is the conclusion. Now, once we have the argument stated in that form, we can go about evaluating it. And sometimes we end up in a little bit of a loop. In a loop in this regard, that is, we go to evaluate the argument and we find out the argument isn't good, but we say, well, wait a second. Maybe there's another way of understanding the argument that's better than this, that doesn't have the problems that this has. So sometimes we go back and we reconstruct the argument, yes, yet again. In fact, we might have different versions, really trying to figure out what the author means, giving them the benefit of the doubt. Because remember, our goal in looking at arguments is not to be the winner. We're not picking winners and losers. We're not picking what team to root for. We're trying to figure out what the truth is. And in looking at the truth, we're trying to get where we need to be. That is, we want to get what is the answer to the question that we're addressing. And the argument is going to help us get there. So just to summarize, there are two steps in argument analysis. Step number one, reconstructing the argument. And step number two, evaluating the argument.